Okay, so we finished last time talking about Jansenism, who was the bishop of which town? Does anybody remember? Hope somebody remembers this one because of the funny story that was told about it. Yes. Yes, that's right. Which was called what? By whom? Anybody remember that? That was the funny story. It was called, yes. Right. By whom? Yes. English soldiers marching into the town in early years of the First World War. At least that's when they first started calling it wipers because they couldn't pronounce Ypres. So back to him. He actually died. So of course the heresy that arose from his works, Jansenism, uh, is takes the name of the author of the book called the Augustinus. Remember, he called it that because he based his writings on St. Augustine. And just keep in mind, St. Augustine did admit to having himself made an error with regard to grace at a certain point. Now, you do see saints, doctors of the church, correcting themselves from time to time. They had clearly no problem doing that when they realized that they had made some error of some kind. Of course, in good faith, but they admitted their errors, which is really an admission of, it's an acknowledgement that we're not infallible. To correct oneself is an admission of that. So, saints, we've seen they've done, of course, St. Augustine wrote a whole book of retractions. But we're not going to go into all of the details of Jansenism. We'll cover some of them just to give enough of a historical context, but we're not going to go into great detail because it belongs more to dogmatic theology to discuss exactly how it goes wrong. But suffice it to say, Cornelius Jansenius died actually before the publication of his work, and in fact seems from what he wrote that he was in good faith, that he went wrong, but that he was in good faith on it. With regard to that, he even said in his Dara says, declaring in his will that he submitted his doctrine to the judgment of the Holy See. It's true. When you study De Ecclesia, you see actually in that course the author de Groot quotes the exact words that he used to essentially say that if there's anything wrong with what I've said, I submit it to the Holy See. But again, he himself was never called to judgment before the Holy See because he died before the publication of his work. So it seems that he himself was in good faith, but we'll see not so much the people who adhered to what he said once it was published and had been spread far and wide and gained adherents, that those adherents were not quite so submissive. So the Augustinus itself is divided into three parts, which treat of grace, free will, original sin, and predestination. So you see why we're not covering it in this class. Those are all things you study in De Gratia. So you'll hear more about all of those things. But just giving a general overview, it covers grace, free will, original sin, and predestination. So again, just a few more details on this. He lays down the principle. He says that the human will is not free. That's what he says. According to his theory, the human will is taken captive and held in bonds by the desire for earthly things and is unable, by its own strength, to raise itself from that condition. This impotence, according to Jansenism, arises from the fact that the will is weakened by concupiscence, which draws it away from what is good into the opposite extreme, so that man can no longer will efficaciously. So with this doctrine of the weakness of the will, he maintains the irresistible force of grace. In other words, that grace cannot be resisted. You'll study all these things in De Gratia. Just be aware that he's saying these things. He says that grace is always efficacious, and it is not in the power of man to avoid or resist its action. So again, summing it up, it was done. This particular summary was given by a member of the theological faculty of Paris in 5 propositions. First, that some of God's commandments are impossible for just men, in spite of their goodwill and endeavors. Secondly, that in the state of fallen nature, we never resist interior grace. Thirdly, for merit or demerit, there is no need of freedom exempt from the necessity of acting, that it is enough to have a liberty free from constraint. Fourth, that the semi-Pelagians were heretics only insofar as they maintained that man can resist interior and prevenient grace. And fifth, that Jesus Christ did not die and did not shed his blood for all men. So again, that's the summary of the Augustinus. Some of these propositions are obviously false, but you'll see all of this in detail, when you study De Gratia. So we'll just leave it at that. On its first appearance at Louvain, this book, the Augustinus, excited on one side the most enthusiastic admiration, while on the other, the censure that it actually merited. So there was a Frenchman, Jean Duverger, also known as the Abbé de Saint-Cyrin, so that's what he's referred to as. He introduced it into France and labored to spread its doctrines. He was actually somewhat imbued with, with the spirit of Calvinism, even if he wasn't an outright Calvinist. But he was also a secret and skillful innovator who knew how to promote the elements of the sect which he wished to draw around him. So he's spreading this in a subversive manner. He managed to get proselytes from various families, and let's see. It seems to say I have to check this. That he directed the Abbey of Port-Royal, so this certainly became the Calvinist headquarters. Also, there's an interesting statement made about Icône, which, of course, the headquarters in many ways of SSPX, or certainly its point of origin. It was said by our Cardinal Journet, given certain similarities between Jansenism and SSPX, he called it Icône Port-Royal sans intelligence, if you can figure out what that means. Basically, Port Royal without the brains. In other words, like the Jansenists, but less intelligent. That's what he called it. So, Probably not the last time we'll see this place, Port Royal in French, but there you have it. Let's go to the chase here. Okay, so with a view to silencing the discussions, so these debates which were growing more bitter, Pope Urban VIII, and this is all during the reign of Pope Urban VIII, published a decree forbidding the reading of the Augustinus. The University of Louvain refused to publish this pontifical order. And it was in vain that the Pope addressed a second brief to the refractory doctors, the ones who were refusing to submit, representing the scandal of their disobedience, so reproaching them for this scandalous behavior. But this second appeal was not any more effective than the first. So leaving these rebels to follow their self-willed course, couldn't do anything to coerce them, he determined, Pope Urban VIII, determined instead to pronounce a solemn and decisive judgment, regardless of the behavior of these people. The work of Jansenius and the writings on both sides of this ongoing debate, this war of words, were placed in the charge of the Holy Office, that they could be examined with the necessary care and attention. So on the report of those with whom he was consulting, after there had been a sufficient investigation to figure out what exactly were the tenets on both sides, or at least of the Jansenists, the faith was clear, but what exactly are the tenets of the Jansenists? After that investigation, including some of his own personal examination, the Pope found that the Augustinus was to be condemned in 2 points. First, because it treated the question of grace in a manner contrary to the formal prohibition of the Holy See, and also in its subject matter, since nearly every page renewed the errors already condemned in the writings of Michael Baius. So again, we're not going to go into all of that. It's things you'll see in De Gratia. I'm not going to be testing you on dogmatic theology if you're still in philosophy. So just essentially reiterated errors that had already been condemned. So it's both this work is condemned both with regard to the way it treats things and also what it's saying. So condemned on those 2 points. So on March 6th, 1642, Pope Urban VIII issued a bull condemning the work. So let me get the name of it here somewhere. In Eminenti. Yes. So. And that's in 1642. He condemned the work, saying, after a thorough examination of the work entitled Augustinus, it has been found to contain a formal expression of several propositions already condemned by our predecessors, which it teaches to the great scandal of Catholics, without any respect for the authority of the Holy See. With the intention of applying a suitable remedy to this disorder, which is agitating all Christian society, and which tends to the ruin of the Catholic faith, we, of our own accord, and remember, popes always use this second person plural when they're talking about their own actions, we, of our own accord, by this present constitution, confirm and approve the constitutions of our predecessors, Popes Pius and Gregory. In virtue of the same authority, we absolutely prohibit and wish that all hold as prohibited the work known as the Augustinus as containing and renewing the articles, opinions, and sentiments censured and condemned by the said constitutions. So again, what we just said, stating that these contain condemned propositions. It's very clear. There's no way you could mistake this for any statement of anything else. That the propositions in this work are condemned. Furthermore, we command, on the pain of incurring the penalties and censures in the institution of Pius, our predecessor, that none of the faithful, of what rank, condition soever, rank or condition soever, so nobody at all, shall presume to speak, write, or dispute concerning the articles condemned in this book. So, closing off every possible way you could get around this condemnation. Absolution from the censures incurred by the refractory shall be exclusively reserved to the sovereign pontiff, except in danger of death. So he is very serious about this. So the judgment of the Roman Church, of the Holy See, to which Jansenism, on his deathbed, declared his submission, did not meet with the same obedience from his disciples. The University of Louvain received the decision only after many delays and evasions. In France, the Archbishop of Paris had silenced both parties even before the decision of the Holy See. As soon as he received the bull, he ordered its reception throughout his whole diocese. And the faculty of Paris actually did support his endeavors by forbidding the condemned propositions to be maintained, even though these propositions still had many partisans, chief among whom was the Abbé Saint-Cyran we mentioned earlier. So, the bull In Eminenti had been sent to all of the Catholic churches in the world and was everywhere received with submission. So the King of Spain, as the sovereign of the Netherlands, remember at this time that area is still under control of the kings of Spain, commanded the doctors of Louvain to follow this example and to put an end to their scandalous opposition. So by this point, these teachers have received censure and in order to cease and desist from teaching what they were teaching from the Pope and from their sovereign. So now they're in double rebellion here. Because the partisans of this error paid as little heed to the royal order as to the pontifical censures. Subterfuge and discussion were multiplied and prolonged in the University of Louvain. So they did exactly the opposite of what they were supposed to do. They were supposed to essentially just shut up and submit, and they did the opposite. They prolonged their discussions. Just a rebellion. So Urban VIII was preparing to fulminate the ecclesiastical censures against the rebel theologians. So he was preparing to implement essentially prosecute them to the full extent of the law, if you will, enact the maximum penalties against them. So Jansenism is, general picture here, is pervading society generally, but especially France. Again, even though the pontifical bull condemning it has been published everywhere, it's still spreading. And when that was the state of things when Urban VIII died in July of 1644. And again, King Louis XIII of France, who is reputed to have been very pious, died before him. Although before he died, his son Louis IV, who would become Louis XIV, had already been born, so there was it would be a very long reign. quite an extremely important one for France in general. But before he died, Louis XIII placed his kingdom under the protection of the Blessed Virgin in 1638, and died in the arms of Saint Vincent de Paul. And also, Cardinal Richelieu had died a few months before that in 1642, at the end of in December of 1642. So, let's see. Yeah, so we'll be covering again. He was the one though. Darras is a French author, and Richelieu, of course, being French, Darras tends to favor Richelieu, but he was responsible for the Treaty of Westphalia, which had very bad results that, in fact, we're still living with. But we'll see those later. So we're mentioning his death now, but let's see. Strange. The dates are maybe wrong here. So did I mention did I cover the Treaty of Westphalia yesterday? Because I thought I had put that off till later. I guess, but we'll see. Right, so it's mostly what Dara says after is mostly political notes. So now we move on to Pope Innocent X. So whose dates are September 15th, 1644. To January 7th, 1655. So cardinals met to elect a successor to Urban VIII, when actually the ambassador of Louis XIV. Yes. Yes, see, it's in 1648. But again, I think there's something wrong here. I think there might be some kind of a typo because it says that Richelieu died in 1642. I think there's something wrong here. I have to check the dates. But in any case, yes, the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648. So that's why I'll be covering in this next reign. But Cardinal Richelieu was definitely involved in that. So we'll see. I'll have to check those dates. And I thought I had included in my notes everything needed to know about the Treaty of Westphalia, but perhaps it got left out somehow. In any case, we'll certainly cover it because that's indispensable when you're to cover the. I can't simply skim over the Treaty of Westphalia when you're covering this period of history. So I'll check those dates. Something's definitely wrong with the dates, probably a typo or something, but something is definitely wrong with the dates that are given here. And yes, I'm not sure what happened to everything I had written on the Treaty of Westphalia, but we'll get to it definitely. So in 1644, the successor of the conclave that was to elect the successor of Urban VIII convened, and they were addressed by the ambassador of Louis XIV, who was only 6 years old, but still, he's still his ambassador, not king himself. Addressed the conclave, so it's an interesting note. And it was, again, on the 15th of September, the date of 1644, that Pope Innocent X was elected. So, at this time, again, so here's the Treaty of Westphalia. All of the attention of all of Europe was fixed on the event, which was to close the 30 Years' War. Again, we're at the end of in the late 1640s here. 1644 was the election of Pope Innocent X, the Treaty of Westphalia. 1648 is a few years after, so things are, whatever the series of wars, they're close to coming to an end. So all eyes were turned towards Westphalia, the city of Munster in Westphalia, where the representatives of all the powers were elaborating the treaty, which was to put an end to the long-continued, decades-long struggles that can't come together to make the 30 Years' War. A papal legate was present to guard the rights of the Holy See, although, as we've seen in previous sections of church history, earlier centuries, those such legates don't always do their jobs. Many times they sell out and essentially betray the Holy See, and the Pope has to annul whatever promises or agreements they've made, concessions they may have given, and say no, they were never authorized to do that, because oftentimes those agreements or concessions could not be made or could not be given. Agreements could not be made, concessions could not be given. But here, still papal legates present, and that was normal. When councils were held away from Rome, it was normal for the Pope to send legates to preside over the councils instead of showing up in person. So the hatred of Protestantism against the Catholic Church was so bitter that the Swedish ambassador, and Sweden being a Protestant country, left the city when the papal legate arrived. So he didn't even want to be in the presence of the Pope's legate. The Swedish ambassador refused to be in the same city, even, as the papal legate. So Darras doesn't give many details of it. He says it's not his intention to speak of the provisions made by it, although we'll go into that. I'll probably take from a different source, but we'll go into that later. But he does admit that it must be said that the Catholic sovereigns did not do for religion what might justly and fairly have been expected from their zeal. He says the legates strove in vain to inspire the ambassadors, so the ambassadors of the various sovereigns, with higher and nobler views, reminding them that the interests of heaven were to, not reminding them, but instead of actually corresponding to that, the interests of heaven were sacrificed to those of earth. So Protestants were conformed in the possession of the archbishoprics, bishoprics, monasteries, and convents which they had seized. And that was also happened when, after long period of persecution in England, when the church managed to reestablish its hierarchy in England, it happened that this is something that's still to come. We're not there yet. But when it happened, the government, the English government, didn't want there to be a Catholic and an Anglican archbishop of the same city, so they had to establish, say, if like the Archbishop of Westminster, for example, to this day is that basically the head or the primary cleric in quotes of the Anglican Church. So there's no Catholic, but there's no Catholic Archbishop of Westminster. I'm sorry, of Westminster, because there's they don't want two bishops in the same see. So there's a problem. So in all those sees where there couldn't be a Catholic archbishop, there was instead put in an apostolic vicar. In other words, somebody to do the work that a bishop would do in those places, but not actually but not technically a bishop, or not maybe being in power of order as a bishop, but not in power of jurisdiction a bishop. So just being like an agent of the Pope instead of a full diocesan ordinary. Again, that's in the future. Also, I think I said that there's an Anglican Archbishop of Westminster. There's the Anglican Archbishop of Canterbury. There's no Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury. Westminster is the one that the Catholics do have. So there's no, but that means that there's no Anglican of Westminster. So sorry about that, slip of the tongue. Anyway, we're looking at the Treaty of Westphalia here. So the Pope and the bishops saw themselves deprived of all active means of jurisdiction over the Catholics residing in Lutheran countries. So the various sects of the Reformation, remember everybody connected to Martin Luther, they all obtained free exercise of their heresies, their Darius uses the words respective worship. So they got to just basically do whatever they wanted. It was agreed that in the countries where the Catholics and Protestants lived together, that each party should keep their property, rights, and revenues of which it could prove possession in the year 1625, which was called the normal year. So it's an important term, the normal year. So again, if they could prove that they held property, rights, or revenues of any kind in that year, that they would get to keep it. Except in, say, one exception. Okay, but in year 1624, this was the problem with it. In the year 1624, most of the church property was in the hands of the reformers. So Protestants held most of it at that time. So that would be easy for them to prove that and take huge amounts of property. Again, what it essentially did, and you can see just from what we've covered here, what it essentially did was divided Europe into Protestant and Catholic sections. So that you have Catholic countries and Protestant countries. It essentially gave up, to a great extent, the various struggles that had been waged up to that time to bring about a restoration of the Catholic control over those areas that had been taken over by heresy. Again, what I would like to actually go into more detail in this, I'll have to track down the details again of exactly, try to get some more, a bigger picture, more detailed picture of what exactly which areas ended up as Catholic and which ones as Protestant, because that could be very interesting to look at that and then to see what effects that has to this day. So, Pope Innocent X was not happy with this. He protested against all the terms unfavorable to Catholics, but he was unheard. The politicians who were governing at the time thought that they had done much in separating their action from that of the papacy. So you see a split here now between the interest of civil governments essentially rejecting the interests of the church, even among Catholics. So having thrown off the guardian authority of the sovereign pontiffs, which had then presided over Europe, their continent was to learn that the church alone was not only the promise of everlasting life, but also alone able to secure the peace and stability of earthly kingdoms. So we're going to learn that the hard way. So turning towards England, which was now demonstrating to the world to what extent the people can fall when they have rejected the true faith. And with that, all respect for lawful authority. So, of course, Henry VIII had let loose against the church all the fury of popular passion. He had, of course, ransacked monasteries and churches and everything. And we saw that even saints who had been venerated in England for many centuries. They dug them up and scattered their ashes. So the same fury was now turned against the royal power, and Charles I became its victim. Never talked about it yesterday. He ended up having his head chopped off. Scotland was invaded by Calvinism, which appeared in the form of the sect of the Puritans, who were fanatical champions of independence, who claimed to rule the public worship entirely and accordingly to their own notions. So, we see this rebellion among heretics, even to the civil power. So Charles I made an attempt to enforce the observance of the established Anglican liturgy, but the royal edict was received with a cry of revolt: Presbyterianism or death. So he wants to exercise a right which supposedly is recognized in the kingdom of being the head of the church, but he's being disobeyed and, in fact, revolted against even in that. So the Puritans drew up and signed what they called a new covenant, which they said was sealed by heaven itself. So, keeping in mind that these people are inspired by Martin Luther, it's really no surprise that they're saying that. So after the announcement that the Spirit of God had revealed itself to Scotland, and that out of the Kirk, or Church of Scotland, there was no salvation, after accusing the Church of being evil for saying that outside of the Church there is no salvation, they say out of the Kirk of Scotland there is no salvation. And after an incredible strain of invectives against Pope Sixtus V, Paul V, Urban VIII, and against the Catholic Church in general, every signer was bound to defend the covenant to the death, even against the king himself. So we have really here concentrated into one rather potent example everything we've seen established earlier about heretics and the way they behave. Definitely they're taking a page from Martin Luther's book here, or multiple pages. So when Charles I, the king, consulted his prime minister, the Earl of Strafford, about the means of crushing a rebellion which had been so organized so powerfully, he got the reply, "Your Majesty should make instant preparations for war, yet with the resolution of doing everything possible to avoid one." So Charles took that advice, or he understood the wisdom of it, but he had the bad idea of calling a national assembly, the Long Parliament, which brought upon England the disastrous revolution, which of course resulted in his own death. So among the ambitious men who met in that famous assembly, there was one of very famous names. Any guesses? Does anybody know who this is? The name you're about to hear? No, nobody's confident enough. Yes, Oliver Cromwell. He was the envoy of the Scotch Puritans, standing, of course, very prominent in this assembly. So Bossuet describes him. Does anybody know who Bossuet was? No? Okay, well, that can be saved. Yes. Yes, he was. He was also a Gallican, but he said a lot of good things. So he said some good things, but can't really recommend him because of his Gallicanism. But he did say some good things, and you see him quoted quite frequently, even by good authors. And so certainly, with regard to a description of Cromwell's character, we can take his words. So of course, he was famous for his eloquence. That's why he became famous. It's often said that if he hadn't been a Gallican, he probably would have been canonized. But yet he was a Gallican. But again, if you don't know what Gallicanism is, we'll save that for later. So Bossuet says about Cromwell that he was a man of unusual depth of mind, as refined in dissimulation as he was skilled in political management. capable alike of undertaking and of concealing any action, equally active and indefatigable in peace and in war, leaving to fortune nothing that he could take from it by counsel and foresight, but yet so watchful and steady that he never missed the occasions thrown in his way. In a word, one of those bold and restless spirits born to change the fortunes of the world. So, a shrewd character and somebody who, in some sense, was born to lead, even if he used his talents for crooked purposes. So, moving on a bit here, it said, "To this man it was given to mislead the people and to prevail against kings. For, when he perceived that in the countless sects which were wandering without any fixed or certain rules, the charm by which all those minds were held in error was the satisfaction of being able to dogmatize without opposition or hindrance from any secular or ecclesiastical authority, he used this weakness with a ready skill, which changed the shapeless mass into a strong and formidable power." So he's quite clever in these things. He's knows how to take advantage of the situation, we'll say. So, again, Bossuet goes on, when once the multitude has been caught in the bait of liberty, it will follow blindly if it but hear the name pronounced. That's an interesting statement. These men, wholly taken up with the first idea which had transported them, ran on without seeing that they were rushing into bondage. And their crafty leader, perceiving that by fighting and teaching, by assuming an infinite variety of characters, by acting the doctor and the prophet, as well as the soldier and the captain, he had so captivated the world that he was now looked upon by the whole army as a chief sent by God to protect independence. And so their leader began to be convinced that he could urge them on still further. Then finally Bossuet concludes, "It was the design of God to teach kings what it costs to quit his church. He would show, by a striking example, to what lengths heresy can go, how naturally indocile and independent it is, how fatal to royalty and to all lawful authority. Besides, when Almighty God has chosen a man to be the instrument of his designs, nothing can check his career. He either fetters or blinds or crushes all that is capable of resistance." So interesting. Stating we have here a very clear example of what heretics do. And we've seen so many examples of that this year. Yet another one. So Cromwell soon made himself the master of a parliament which wanted no master. So, interesting way to put that. Then we're back to Darras. Forced into a war with his rebellious subjects, Charles was defeated and withdrew to Scotland. He was told that a prince hostile to the covenant cannot be admitted into the kingdom of the saints. So he's supposed to be the king, but they're telling him that, oh, remember this covenant we have with heaven is higher than any authority, so get lost, basically. So Dara says sarcastically that the Scottish saints sold their king to the saints of England for the sum of £8,000. So he went to Scotland and then got sent back sold to English rebels. So he was then doomed to a hard captivity. Innocent X raised his voice against the outrage. And remember, Charles I isn't even a Catholic, and the Pope is denouncing this rebellion because he's the legitimate king of England, even if he's not legitimately the head of the Church of England. That's a schismatic sect, of course. But even as legitimate king of England, the Pope is denouncing this revolt. So, but again, nobody paid any attention to that because for too long England had been taught to disregard the voice of the Pope. So, kings, of course, had given the first examples of contempt for the Holy See. We saw that among the German princes, in Henry VIII, obviously. And now the people, in turn, refused to hear the same Holy See when the Holy See was undertaking the defense of the kings. So you see a number of interesting things here that obviously the church never condones revolt against legitimate authority. Even if that legitimate authority may be tyrannical, if it is still legitimate, it is still basically providing for the common good of the country, it's still the church does not condone a revolution against it, even if that authority is not Catholic, and even if it has been persecuting the church, or has persecuted the church. Still, the church does not condone a revolt against that authority. But at the same time, again, these civil rulers who made heresy possible in their territories are now reaping the bitter fruits of having done so in examples like this. So, the independents and the agitators in London, rebels essentially, excited by the council of fanatical leaders, called for the head of Charles. So it wasn't enough to expel him from part of his own kingdom and send him to rebels in another part of that kingdom. Now they want to kill him. So Henrietta of France, who was Queen of England, so the wife of King Charles, tried to exercise whatever influence she had to save the king, but her efforts came to nothing. And on the 20th of January in 1649, Charles was brought before a self-constituted court of justice. So, but we'll see what happens. I mean, you know what happens, but we'll go into more detail next time. And then I also look a little more into the Treaty of Westphalia for the next class to see, make sure you have all the right dates and maybe go into a little more detail on what exactly happened there.